Hello, I'm Eric Steinhardt, and let's talk about cannabis. So, I'd like to talk a little bit about Stephen DeAngelo's article about using cannabis for wellness, not intoxication, because that can really kind of set the stage for us about how we can think about cannabis and how people use cannabis in new ways. But let's start with traditional concepts of cannabis that go back hundreds and thousands of years. And the two main ways of thinking about cannabis, about how people use cannabis and how human beings relate to cannabis, there were two main ways of thinking about this. And the first way was medicinal. Cannabis was a kind of medicine. The plant and its derivatives were used to treat illnesses, diseases, and uncomfortable conditions of human life. The second main use was for spiritual or religious purposes. Cannabis could assist with meditation or help your mind relax so that you could focus more intensely on the divine or some other religious or spiritual agent or activity. So these two traditional uses, the medical and the spiritual or religious uses, they last for a long time. That's how people think about cannabis in ancient times, in medieval times, and early modern times. In the 1850s or so, a bunch of French poets and other European artists started to use cannabis artistically, right? They thought that cannabis could give them certain types of visions or expand their creative or divergent thinking and help them make better poetry, better literature, or better art. And so this is a third use, which is an artistic use of cannabis. And that goes on for a little while, but you still have mostly the medical, the spiritual, and now the artistic uses until around the 1950s or 1960s in the United States. And at this point, cannabis becomes associated with intoxication. It becomes a recreational drug or a party drug associated with hedonism. And it also becomes associated with, hippie culture, right, which was perceived as a hedonistic culture, a culture that valued pleasure, right, and pleasures of the body, sensual pleasures, above all other things. And so this hedonistic use of cannabis was also associated with some idealism, right? The hippies had some idealistic visions, utopian visions. They wanted to transform society and, ideally to make society better. They wanted American society to become less competitive, less materialistic, more focused on humane values, and often in a certain way, right, more spiritual. And the hippies were often inspired by Hinduism and Buddhism and by Eastern religion to think about spirituality. So some of the old uses of cannabis still were there in the hippie days, but they started to get blended in with the notion that cannabis is a party drug, right? Weed. Let's get high. Let's smoke some weed. And this led to stoner culture, right? Where again, right, smoking pot, smoking weed, associated with smoking. Of course, there's lots of films, right? People, there's sort of comedies or stoner films, right? And stoner culture really emerges not so much in the 60s with the hippies, because the hippies were still idealistic in lots of ways, but stoner culture kind of emerges in the 70s, right? And the stoner is, incompetent and dysfunctional. They can't really get their life together. They're if you think about these stoner movies or stoner culture, the stoners are impoverished. They're poor. They don't function well in society. They're often antisocial. They just want to, sit around in the basement or something and get high. And they're not very good persons. They're not role models, that's for sure. And so cannabis gets a very negative stigma associated with it from stoner culture. And still also a little bit from hippie culture, right? The hippies were perceived as in some ways anti-American or, negative kinds of social views. So, right. D'Angelo and other people have argued very effectively, I think, for getting rid of the notion of stoner culture and its ways of using cannabis. And so, one of the things we do is we go back here to thinking about using cannabis in medical ways. Right? Cannabis is often legal medically, even in places where it's not legal for full adult use. And we don't talk about using cannabis recreationally. There's no such thing. Recreational is like miscellaneous. It doesn't mean anything, or it just means non medical, which again is just kind of negative and meaningless. So we stop talking about recreational use and start thinking about things like full adult use, a much better and more positive way of framing cannabis use. And instead of thinking of it as a stoner drug, a party drug that you smoke, think about it in terms of wellness. That's D'Angelo's point, right? Wellness is far more general than medical. Medical uses are using cannabis or its molecules to treat specific diseases or illnesses, whereas wellness aims at a more kind of holistic health, right? It's not just curing a disease, but making you healthy, where health is more than just the absence of illness. And so cannabis and its molecules are used for the enhancement of life and the enhancement of positive values of living. Some of those uses go back to some of the spiritual, religious, and artistic uses that predated hippie culture. But this involves changes in use patterns, right? Where there's less focus on smoking or even on vaping, right? Where cannabis was sort of thought to be analogous to cigarettes, right? Or to alcohol as a recreational drug, right? So instead of thinking about cannabis as something that you smoke, instead the wellness focus moves to thinking about it in terms of consuming it through things like tinctures, edibles, things like this, where you can have more focus on the dose. With smoking, you don't know how much of a dose of any molecule you're getting. You just get some. Whereas with using things like edibles or oils that you take sublingually, under your tongue, you can focus very closely on dosage. You can get the exact dose of particular molecules that you want. You can focus much more on side effects, on avoiding negative side effects, such as executive dysfunction or short-term memory dysfunction. And in other words, you're using it for the benefit of life. You're not using cannabis to be a stoner, right? To be someone who's incompetent, socially dysfunctional, personally unable to get their life together. You're using cannabis as life enhancing, right? World enhancing, as a better way of being in the world. And using it in these other ways, right? With smoking, you can't control the different ratios of the molecules you're getting. But using it for wellness, you start to focus on not just THC, right? Because stoner culture was like, hey, more THC, man. No, that's not a good way to think about all the values of the cannabis plant. A much better way is to think about all the molecules in it, not just THC, but CBD, right? And all the terpenes that come with cannabis, because terpenes are very powerful psychoactive molecules. Things like D-limonene and alpha-pinene can have very interesting effects on the mind, often very beneficial and salutary effects for a holistic concept of the body and self as an organism, a unified whole that functions in a harmonious way to make a kind of beautiful music of life. So these are some changes that Stephen D'Angelo points to in his article on using cannabis for wellness, not intoxication. And that's something we really want to use to set the tone for everything we think about cannabis. It's a new way of looking at cannabis. Thank you very much. I'm Eric Steinhardt, and we've got lots more to think about with cannabis.